effective. Okay, so moving on. Um, I have some notes here, and it's interesting that I wanted you guys to see this thumbnail because this is from my Canon digital camera. And what I would do on set was for each shot that I was lighting, I would take a photograph using my Canon digital camera. I would then import that photograph into Photoshop, and I would do a quick workup on it. So I knew that, you know, Charles was going to want this cyan look on the final images. So in the process of lighting a shot, what I would do is I would then put this image into Photoshop, and I would do the same kind of coloration and so forth, and really look at it and manipulate the contrast and the color balance to see if the resulting image was going to render out the way I thought it was under the lighting. But this is the unaffected lighting before we took it into post at Deluxe in Toronto. So this is a thumbnail right out of my camera. Kodak has a process called the look management system, which is basically the same thing with one key exception, and that is in the software for the look management system, Kodak has put lookup tables into the software that you can lay over the image. Instead of going into Photoshop and doing all the corrections yourself, you can just use the Kodak lookup tables, and each one of those is formulated to the film stocks that you're shooting. So if you're shooting 5296, or if you're shooting 5219 or 5218, and you want to know what that film stock is going to look like, but you've shot the image on your Canon 5D, let's say, you can put that lookup table on that image in the software right there on set, and you can verify what it's going to look like. That's if you're shooting film. Now, if you're shooting digital, your DIT can do this for you right there on set. The problem with a film camera is any of the video signal that's coming out of the film camera is being rendered by an imager in a video assist module inside the camera, and it's not seeing what the actual image on the film is recording. So it's an interpretation of that resulting image that you're getting from the film camera on the monitors on set, and it's not completely accurate to what is possible with that image in post-production. On the other hand, if you're shooting with an Alexa, you're getting the real digital signal out of that camera, and you can pipe it to the DIT, and the DIT can map a real-time lookup table onto that image, and you can avoid having to use the supplementary camera and software system. So it's just a question of what format you're shooting and how your workflow is on set, how you're going to go about solving this problem. But the whole point in creating these images was to verify with the director that our lighting results were what he wanted, and then the images that I was creating on set were then printed out and then taped to the film cans of the stock that was committed to this scene. And when it went to the lab, that photograph followed that film all the way through the process of being developed, and then moving on to digital intermediate, and then to the editors, where the editors and colorists would then see the actual footage and then see the thumbnail photograph that came with it, so they could put a cursory color correction on the stuff for dailies and for inspection viewing by the director. And then, of course, the colorist had a reference to go by when they were sitting down in post and starting to do the actual color correction. But getting back to the topic of the practicals, if you shoot under flat lighting, it doesn't really render well. It doesn't give you good shape, texture, and tone. It's just sort of what we call pancake lighting. So we want to try and control that as much as we can, and only use flat lighting when it seems to really suit the story. We want to focus on texture, shape, and form, because anytime we move our lights and anytime we change our lights from harder to softer output, warmer or cooler colors, and frontal, sidey, or back motivated projection, we change the psychological impact of that image for the audience. Okay, and a lot of subtext can be derived from just the placement of our key light. Okay, so it's important to remember that we're creating depth in the shot, we want to create a feeling that the audience will connect with viscerally and associate with the overall mood of the story. And the mood here was very solemn, so it needed to look pretty brutal. And I think we pulled it off, but you let me know what you think in the comments. Okay, so remember this guy? Remember Rembrandt? He was the focus of our conversation when we started the discussion about three-point lighting. It's his visual style that we often emulate in our motion picture lighting. It's the existence of a prominent key light. It has a fill light that forms a what we call a golden triangle under the low side eye. There's a measure of contrast, and in many cases, he doesn't use an edge light, and only about half the time would he use an actual fill light. Oftentimes, the rendering that comes from Rembrandt's inspiration is from one light source, and it's the properly or perfectly placed light source, you might say. So I'm going to add a fourth light to our three-point lighting scenario. So I guess technically that makes it four-point lighting, but for the sake of this conversation, I just want you to consider the background light. In addition to the key light, the fill light, and the edge light, and the fact that other than the key light, the other two are kind of optional, right? Rembrandt only used a key light, and sometimes he didn't use fill, and he certainly didn't use edge lights very often. So you definitely need a key light, but maybe not those other two. But what might help is, if you're only using a key light, is having a background light. In other words, something that can put a little measure of luminosity on objects, details in the background, even if they fall out of focus, that's fine. But it helps to create a little bit of depth and a little bit of separation for your subject. So as they move through the foreground, you can get a sense of their, their shape and volume under their key light, and then a little bit of distinctive separation between the foreground and the background. It helps the audience locate and follow the action in a dark frame. If you don't have an edge light, if you at least have a background light going on. So think about that in terms of adapting your three-point lighting scenario. Sometimes your edge light can become a background light instead of an actual edge light because the objective truly is separation. And in that case, you could use the edge or backlight interchangeably with the background light. The difference being the edge light shining on the talent and the background light is shining away from the talent onto details in the depth of the frame. So if we think about our three-point lighting approach and what the objective is, I want to refresh your memory and remind you that in cinematography we seek to render three-dimensional objects with a two-dimensional medium. So three-point lighting helps us create depth with shadows and with color and contrast. It helps us create a sense of space in the cinematic frame. It's a feeling of foreground, middle ground, and background. Okay, the shapes, textures, colors, volume, and size are all governed by the careful placement of our light sources. And in fact, I have a supplementary assignment in terms of PDF handout that I've given some of you already. And in that exercise, we take a central subject, a camera, and one light source, and we move it to all the positions around the clock, move it around that subject, and look at how the shape and texture and therefore tone of that shot changes based on the placement of that light. It's very important to understand that that portion of control that we have over our fixtures is a direct link to subtext and how our audience feels about the subjects they're looking at on screen or the scene or the action taking place. Okay, if you want to take advantage of the lighting that is available to you, make sure that it can conform to all the criteria of our three-point lighting method. Okay, and if it fulfills that criteria, then it's certainly a viable alternative to conventional fixtures. So here's a quick diagram of the three-point lighting method illustrated in terms of all of the different positions. So you see we have a key light position 45 degrees off axis to the camera, and you can pick left or right side. That's really dealer's choice. I tend to be left-handed, so I start with a key light on the left side of camera just naturally, and I decide whether or not that looks right for the scene and for the action that's going to take place. It's very important, especially when you're doing your pre-light, to have stand-ins to help you demonstrate the actor's movements and intentions in that scene that have been rehearsed prior to your lighting. Because if a person's going to move from left to right in front of the camera and you key them from the left side, they're going to be walking away from their source. And is that going to be appropriate or not? If it's a window, certainly it is appropriate. If not, you might want to flip and put your key on the right side of the camera instead of the left side so that it can maintain shape on that subject as they move from left to right and maintain the same shape in terms of continuity. So it's really up to you. And then the opposite side of camera is where you're going to start with your fill. You decide if you need it at all, and if you do, a good place to start is directly opposite of the key light so that it can wrap around the subject to the lower dark side of the situation and open up some of the shadows. Remember, the fill light's chief responsibility is controlling contrast. So if you have deep shadows that are generated by your key light placement, then your fill light is going to help open up those shadows and reveal some detail to camera so that it doesn't look quite so harsh. And then, of course, the backlight, in this case, it's called a hair light. That's a bit of a dated term, but all it really does is create separation for the subject from the background, and usually it does so by setting off a little highlight in the hair itself. Okay, so here's your key light recap. Main source of illumination. It creates or establishes your basic shape, volume, color, and texture. It can affect the narrowness or fullness of the face depending on its placement. So a light fixture that comes from 90 degrees off axis to the camera lens is what we call a half light key. And when you do that, it has a thinning effect on whoever you're lighting. So keep that in mind as well. Position your subject near that source and start 45 degrees off axis to the lens. If it's a front side key, if it's a backlight key, you need the supplementary angle of 45 degrees. So you would pick 135 degrees off axis from the lens. And that is a good place to start with your backlight, okay? Or with your, with your backside key light. The fill light creates or controls the contrast, okay? The more contrast you have, the more moody your shots are, okay? The less contrast you have, the more bright and open and airy feeling your shots are. So more contrast is moody, right? So that could help the audience or imply to the audience that they should be feeling fear or anxiety or apprehension. And then brighter, lower contrast lighting schemes might suggest to the audience a happy feeling, a loving feeling, an open feeling, an informed feeling. Okay? So the fill light is going to help you control all of those moods and attitudes of your audience. Okay? The fill light is often a supplementary light, and it can be done either proactively with a fixture, or it can be done passively with a bounce card. But either way, you're still controlling the contrast and therefore the level of fill, whether it's with a bounce card or an actual light fixture. And if we move on, here's the part of the program where I talk to you about negative fill. So in the age of digital cameras, the capture devices in these digital cameras have extended dynamic range, meaning that they can record a range of values from extreme shadow to extreme highlight equally and at the same time within an overall lighting scheme within a shot. Okay, so in the old days, if you shot with some of the initial digital cameras that came out, some of the DSLRs, and if you shot, say, in a room in your house and there was a window in the shot, the window would be utterly blown out, maybe solarizing, definitely blooming, and no detail could be visible outside the windows if you were trying to expose for objects within the room. Now, a camera with extended dynamic range, it might be able to see detail outside of those windows instead of rendering that window as just a big white blown out blob. Okay? And in essence, what's happening is the chips are becoming more sensitive and they're becoming capable of stretching their sensitivity to include details in the shadow and details in the highlights at the same time. When you have that kind of power at your disposal, it often negates the need for a fill light. In fact, the ambience in a room, once you add a key light, might sort of create its own sense of fill with a really sensitive digital sensor, like in an Area Alexa or a Blackmagic Cinema camera, for instance. So what we have to do is remove reflected or ambient light from the subject so that only the key and its influence and its direction is creating the shape and texture, and then we use black reflection from either from a flag or a black bounce card or a 6x or 8x black overhead to actually kill the reflections coming from off camera and creating or introducing a sense of shadow that wasn't ordinarily there. And let me see if I can show you some examples. The TV show Ozark, which is currently showing on Netflix, is a good example of some really contrasty, low-key lighting where they use negative fill quite a lot. You can see here, this is the husband and wife team. It's Jason Bateman and Laura Linney. They play a married couple who he's an accountant and she is a former political player who is now a stay-at-home mom. And the two of them get mixed up in the drug underworld. Marty takes a client who ends up being a drug kingpin, and Marty ends up having to launder money for his client. And in the process, they get dragged into a life of a crime and risk. And so the mood of the show is often stressful and anxious, and certainly bright and open and airy shots like you see in the top image without the negative fill aren't nearly as effective as when you add the negative fill as in the bottom frame. And you can see with a little bit of color correction to cool the image down and the addition of those deeper, darker shadows from the negative fill, it has a totally different tone. And you have a totally different sort of feeling about, this is Marty and his wife in the show. You have a definitely different feeling about this couple in the bottom image than you do about them in the top image, right? So here's how you would achieve it, right? We have the natural sunlight happening. And this image, this diagram was created with Hollywood Camera Work in the Shot Designer portion of the application. It's free for you to use. You only have to pay for the software if you want the pro version and the ability to record all of your results to the Hollywood Camera Work servers. If you don't care about that capability and you just want to use screen grabs after you've used the software to render out your diagrams, like I've done here, you are totally welcome to use that software for free. They condone it themselves on their website, and they even offer you the ability to download the software into your laptop, whether you're using Mac or PC. They have versions for either one. And they encourage you to use their product, and I think it's a pretty handy product. And you can see here that I created a quick diagram illustrating the negative fill setup that you saw in the previous image. So we got the available light coming from the sun, and then that has probably been diffused, and they'll use 12 by 12 foot silk diffusion stretched onto a frame supported by a couple of stands. Could be 20 by 20 feet, but more than likely it was 12 by 12 feet because it's more manageable. And you need fewer grips to help you deploy something like that outside. And then they staged Jason and Laura in front of the camera in a two-shot. And they brought in an 8x8, we call it a black solid, for negative fill. Okay, and the 8x8 is also a fabric panel that is stretched onto a frame, a tube frame, and supported by a couple of stands. And they'll just march that negative fill right in until it's right off of frame right, and doing the maximum amount of shadow control, and then they'll march in that diffusion as close as they can get that as well to to sort of imitate the results of an overcast sky, and then with maybe a little in-camera filtration or maybe not, certainly in post, add a little bit of blue tone to this image, and you get what we had here, which is our hero characters being confronted by a member of the cartel. Okay, and so they have to account for where they've been for the past couple of days, and there's a lot of things going on in the plot. I don't want to give anything away, but you're supposed to feel right now the danger that these two are in by lying to the cartel about where they've been for the past couple of days. And the negative fill, I think, really helps. It introduces a level of contrast that you wouldn't ordinarily see in an exterior shot because there's so much reflection. In the shot above, you got reflection from the sunlight hitting the house and bouncing back onto the set. You've got reflection off the grass. You've got reflection off of the sky behind camera. You've got all this light bouncing around outside, and it's very hard to introduce contrast outside without using negative fill. So we bring in our big black panels, our fabric panels. We call them textiles or rags. The grips like to call them 8 by rag, 12 by rag, and then you just specify the fabric by saying, bring me a 12 by silk or bring me an 8 by solid. And we can make great use of the available light, and it's all about control, right? We're just softening the sunlight so it's not quite so hard on the key side, and then we're using negative fill on the fill side to control and introduce a little contrast. Okay, so the recap is the rim or the edge light is important when establishing the profile or the positioning of the subjects in the frame against the background, so it separates them from the background. It's usually positioned directly behind them, but not always. It can be anywhere from 135 degrees off axis to the lens to directly behind and above the subject. Either way, it's mostly about providing separation, so however you want to achieve that is up to you. It emanates more often than not from overhead. It may appear broader or softer, thinner or harder, depending on the angle to the lens. So broader angles to the lens will have a wider, softer effect than angles coming from directly behind the subject in a real steep angle, where you get the maximum amount of reflectivity into the lens, and therefore it looks brighter and harder as a result. This is your edge light, and like I said, it's all subjective. You may prefer to shoot without them, but there are occasions where an edge light is really going to be appropriate, right? So here's Marty handcuffed and sitting on the floor of a warehouse. He's just come into contact with his boss, who he's doing the money laundering for. He hasn't met him up to this point, and his boss has just murdered 2 guys in front of Marty, and he's trying to convince or find out if Marty has been stealing from him, and whether or not Marty's going to be killed as well. So he's sitting there and he's waiting to find out what his fate is, and he's in a warehouse. It's a dark warehouse. There is some light going on in the background, but I think if you look at Marty's left shoulder and you can see where he's not getting much of his edge light hitting on that side of his body, or his left knee for that matter, the degree of separation you have against the background on his left side is far different than the separation you're getting on Marty's right side. He's got separation on his hair, on his shoulder, on his knee, and all of that is really helping to sort of set Marty off in the foreground against information and detail in the background. The background's all blown out of focus anyway, so we're not really supposed to be looking back there. The depth of field is reverting our eyes back to the foreground, but the separation helps for us psychologically to locate Marty quickly in the frame and start understanding and digesting the action that's taking place so we can keep up with the story. Okay, so in a 3-point scenario, we've got a key light, and in this particular case, I've positioned it off camera right. I have a Lee gel diffusion frame in front of that light to soften it a little bit, and the idea here is have the edge light marked, and it's in the upper left of the frame. The nickname we give a light like this is called a kicker, and oftentimes the kicker can come from below, not from above, or it can come from above the subject and certainly from behind. So that represents about a 135-degree angle, and as we move that edge light in the direction of the red arrow, that's going to make the edge light thinner and crisper in appearance around our subject's profile as we move it from left to right across the frame. Okay, we have to make sure we keep that light high enough so that it's out of the frame and not creating a flare on the lens, which is generally why these backlights come from above, because it's a lot easier to use a flag and set it near camera as a lenser and keep the flare from hitting the lens if the light is up high, certainly above the height of the subject. Okay. You can create these diagrams again from Hollywood Shot Designer, and I put the link down below in the bottom of the frame. Okay, planning it all out. Okay, if you want to see how Hollywood Shot Designer works, you can go to my YouTube page and look at the exercise that introduces Hollywood Shot Designer. It's about a 25-minute video, and I show you all the tools and all of the icons that are available within the software, and you can create diagrams like I've been working with here. I like them because you can create documents in pre-production if you're planning or scouting for your film and you want to think about your lighting ahead of time, create a plan so that on the day when you walk in, you're not devising from scratch, you're actually working from a plan that you've already figured out in pre-production and gotten approved by the director and the DP if you're the gaffer, for instance. And you can give that lighting diagram out to a number of different people so they all have the information ahead of time. And that's part of the pre-production planning process. It's a pretty handy tool to use in pre-production so that everybody knows and we're on the same page walking into a scene at the beginning of the day, what's going to happen, what the lighting is going to be, what kind of equipment is involved, and it helps the assistant directors to plan our production schedule accordingly. All right, so if you're looking at available light and you're trying to find light that's usable, okay, you're going to be qualifying that light, you're going to be looking at the quality of it, deciding if it's appropriate to your story, and then looking for the shooting opportunities in the naturally lit environments that represent all of the aesthetic qualities we aspire to in three-point lighting: shape, texture, color, tone, directionality. Okay, the Tree of Life is a really great example of this because the urban legend is that in the process of scouting, the DP, Emmanuel Lebetsky, ordered a standard lighting package from the rental house and had it for the first week of shooting. And within days of production, determined that he was getting better results from the available light and the grip support that he could add to the available light, like the negative fill and the diffusion frames and so forth, that he basically sent all the lights back to the rental house and canceled the lighting package for the remainder of the shoot. Now, I don't know if it really went down that way because I wasn't there, but I can tell you that more often than not, we use grip lights outside. We call them grip lights because it's the grip department's equipment. It's not the electric department. And because when you add lights outside, if you add one light, invariably you have to add at least one more and possibly two more to your lighting scenario. And that's a lot of work, especially when you've got an abundance of available light outside from the sun already. Why do you want to reinvent the wheel by adding additional lighting or contrast to a situation that doesn't call for it? So we use grip equipment instead, diffusion and negative fill and flags and bounce cards and things. And we work with what's there. And a lot of times it works out very well and the results can be very effective. A lot of movies like this. The Tree of Life is a really great example of a movie that was shot almost entirely with natural available sunlight. And it's been redirected and bounced and diffused accordingly to look theatrical. Another example by the same DP, Emmanuel Lebetsky, would be The Revenant. Okay, he shot that movie in the same fashion. All available light with digital acquisition devices, the Arri Alexa cameras. And I think the effects are the results are very effective. And you should look at these movies. If you haven't seen them already, you should definitely watch them and evaluate for yourself the results and decide if that's something that you might want to emulate in your own personal style. Okay, redirected sunlight, aka the bounce light. Okay, Mark Vargo is a DP that's been working in Hollywood for a number of years, he has a really terrific video on YouTube called Grip and Go, and it's a terrific video. And it outlines what is Grip It Good. I'm sorry. It outlines what the grip department does on a daily basis on a film shoot, and it talks about bounce light and diffusion and textiles, differences in reflectivity, silver surfaces, gold surfaces, white surfaces. He talks about the use of shiny boards and mirror boards for creating light sources on set by redirecting available sunlight. And it's a really effective video. So I have that for you here. There's also a link for it below if you want to check it out on YouTube yourself. But this is Mark Vargo, ASC, and this is his video called Grip It Good.
The key grip is a department head and participates in the preparation phase of production. During prep, the key grip works closely with the cinematographer and the gaffer. This is when the script is broken down, locations are scouted, tests are conducted, and any special equipment required is either fabricated or arranged for. The importance of prep cannot be overstated. Every key grip I know works hard to design the very best shooting plan possible within this time frame. Everyone marvels at the beauty of natural light, but the problem is it isn't guaranteed and it never lasts very long. That's why most of us prefer the control of shooting on stage rather than battling the sun, the clouds, and the wind. Think of the grip department as the infantry that outflanks the challenges of day exterior conditions. These grips are building a 12 by 12 frame for a scene on the beach today. This one will be used to bounce light onto the actor. In most cases, you want the sun behind your subject, location permitting. This is called shooting in backlight. Grips have all kinds of cards and fabrics for softening or bouncing light to achieve a balanced exposure. The kind of bounce you choose is based on the needs of the story. Unless it's cloudy, day exterior bounce fill relies on the sun. The amount of light hitting the subject is determined by the kick angle of the bounce source. I tend to set that level by eye. The lighting in this shot is flat. To add contrast, we create negative fill by placing large black flags on one side of the subject. This cuts the ambience and darkens one side of the face, giving it shape and character. Grips can also use highly reflective boards to direct sunlight where it is desired. Not surprisingly, these boards are called reflectors, or shiny boards.
This is probably the most primitive, basic lighting instrument we have. Been around since the teens. This is what the soft sign looks like to an actor. There's a soft sign. Handing it off. And here's the hard side. Handing on. Boom.
For a straight dose of sunlight, they carry large mirrors. Obviously, you need the sun for these to work and a steady hand on them to prevent the beam from jittering in the wind.
So it's a primitive unit, and they're a bit passé now, but we drag one out every week on every shoot for something. Either a splash of light on a back wall, a little soft fill coming in a window, you name it.
Occasionally, we have to shoot when the sun is directly overhead. To help reduce unflattering top light, the grips will build a frame and tie a silk or some other diffuse fabric to it. If your scene starts out under cloudy conditions and then clears off, the grips will build a large frame and skin it with a heavy diffusion material to create a cloudy feel. And that maintains the lighting continuity throughout the scene.
Okay, so I've only isolated a minute and 57 through 6 minutes and 12 seconds. That was all the information pertinent to the exterior shots. But I wanted to introduce that stuff to you folks in case you haven't seen that method of working before, to give you a sense of what we do outside. We don't just shoot under raw natural sunlight because it tends to be unflattering, and it also tends to be way too harsh and sometimes not even the right color for what we want to render on camera. But the whole point of showing you that was to show you the tools that the grips were using, and to give you some sense that you don't have to have a lot of money, and you don't have to have a grip truck in order to recreate some of the same results. And PVC is like the Tinker Toys for grown-up film people. Okay, and it's cheap and it's readily available. There's a Home Depot in every community, and a Lowe's and an Ace Hardware. You take your pick. Home Depot tends to be the cheapest. You can go to Home Depot and you can buy PVC, and you can create 6 by 8 by even 12 by frames if you choose the right gauge of pipe, and build the whole frame for a handful of dollars, and then go to Walmart and look at some inexpensive, cheap bedding. The white polyester bedding is fine. You're not going to be sleeping on it. You're going to use it as a diffuser outside. And oftentimes the bedding will have a hem on there that you can pass a PVC pipe through. And if not, it's certainly easy to ask somebody with a sewing machine to put some hems on the material for you, so that you can actually attach it to the PVC pipe. And then just support that PVC frame with a couple of light stands or a couple of C stands and a couple of clamps. And you can produce the same results that the Hollywood grips are producing, with some really inexpensive materials. And then when the whole thing is said and done, if you want to just toss it all away, your total investment for this little 6x6 diffusion frame, for instance, might be less than 10 or 15 bucks. Okay, but you can do it. It's easy to do, and it's something that is manageable by one person as well. So that's just one of the DIY solutions that I like to introduce students to give you a sense that it's not all inaccessible, and it's not all expensive, complicated hardware that you have to access in a production market like Hollywood or Atlanta. You can do this in your own backyard with stuff that you can access from Home Depot. In the same vein, if you go to the art supply store, they sell the foam board called Foam Core, or Show Card, which is really just acid-free archival art board, white side on black side. And that's perfectly adequate bounce material. We use that on film sets all the time. Foam Core is fairly rigid. It's about 1/4 of an inch thick. It's got white papered backing on the front and back side, and then it has there's a styrofoam center to it, which gives it some rigidity, and you can use that. It's kind of in 2x3, 3x3, and 4x4, 2x4 foot sizes. It's rigid enough to support itself if you want to clamp it from one end and support that with a stand, and use it as a bounce card that you can direct and lock in place with a clamp and a stand. It's very handy. You can also hand hold a foam core bounce board, walk with it, stand there and hold it, redirect a little fill into a close-up, for instance. It's really handy, but it's a material that we call expendable. In other words, we buy it in bulk for a film shoot. We might buy it in 4x8 sheets, the foam core and the styrofoam bead board. Cut it up into usable sizes, like 2x2 pizza boxes, we call them, or 4x4 bounces. And then at the end of the shoot, when they're all raggedy and beat up, we just toss it in a dumpster, because it doesn't cost very much. It's really effective as a lighting tool. It's lightweight, and it's easy to transport around in the truck. And then when we don't need it anymore, we just toss it away. So you have access to these materials every day, because we get the stuff from the same place you're going to get it from, Home Depot and the art supply store down the street. So some of the same tools that Hollywood grips are using on set every day come from pretty common places like Home Depot and in this case Santa Fe Art Systems. Okay, and there's an art supply store in every town. Certainly you have a Michaels. or you have a Walmart Supercenter, which has a huge arts and crafts department. Art Systems is nationwide, as well as Joann Fabrics for some of the materials that we use, some of the textiles we use, silks and black felt, or black cotton canvas, or white reflective material like bedding and so forth. You can get all that at Walmart or Joann Fabrics. Both of those are great sources, and they're cheap. If you want to purchase a product that's sort of pre-made and easy for you to operate, this is what we call a flex fill, or a flexible reflector. This one's a product by the company Neewer, and it's a 43-inch diameter, 5-in-1 reflector, we call it. So it's got a white side, which reflects light with a neutral tone. It's got a black side you can use for negative fill. It has a gold side, which will give a warmer, harder reflected tone to your subject. A silver side, which gives a cleaner, whiter, but harder reflected tone. And then that last disc in the back is actually a silk diffuser, which you can put over somebody's head and soften up the direct, hard overhead sunlight into something softer and kinder to somebody's close-up. This one happens to be, like I said, 43 inches in diameter. They come in a variety of sizes, anywhere from 6 inches in diameter, believe it or not, to 72 inches in diameter. And they just fold up with, you twist with opposing hands, and they fold up into a reduced size and get stored in a little slip case. So this is a really handy tool. You can see that this one that's 43 inches in diameter sells for about $25 on Amazon. I've never been on a film shoot that didn't have at least one of these laying around, if not more, in a variety of sizes. They're super handy. They've got a little stirrup cloth handle on one side that you can use to hang it from a stand, or hang it from a doorknob, or mount it to any number of different structures just to hold it in place while you use it as a reflector. So these are a really convenient tool, and they're really cheap, and it makes a lot of sense for you to have it in your personal kit, no matter whether you're a lighting person or a grip, or even a camera person for that matter. You will use a flexible reflector, I guarantee it. Okay, here's a video that I produced. I want to talk to you a little bit now about using window light if you're doing day interiors. Window light is a wonderful source. It works well as a key light source if you have a well-placed window in a location. If you're shooting a scene in a house interior, for instance, if you can position your subjects near open windows that you can control with curtains and with shears that can act as diffusion. You can even project lights through a window if it gets dark and the effect of the sun has sort of diminished. You can light through a window from the outside with additional conventionals. But the light that comes through a properly staged window, as long as it's not hard sunlight, oftentimes has a very flattering, a very beautiful effect, and therefore works well as a key light in a broad variety of situations. So let's take a moment and let me talk to you a little bit about window light and what my sort of thoughts are about window light and my philosophy about using windows in shots.
Okay, if we're going to shoot in practical locations, like I'm here in my den, in my house, one of the prettiest sources that we could choose, I think, would be window light. You obviously are working with what's available coming from the sun. It's a nice big source coming through the window. It's wrapping very nicely. In order to get this same kind of diffused wrapping effect, we would have to use a very large artificial source on stage, for instance, and put it through, I think, probably a couple of different layers of diffusion. Large frame diffusion and smaller frame diffusion, or diffusion directly on the fixture itself, and then large frame diffusion with what I call giving it a little air. In other words, some space in between the source and the diffusion panel to allow
the softness to sort of expand in volume and fill the space with a larger presence of light. So if I'm dealing with a light that is emitting uh, uh, volume into a room, and that window is 4 feet tall and 4 or 6 feet wide, um, that that's a tremendous presence in that space. And so to use a small fixture like a lamp or even a small conventional really is not going to give you the same sense uh, of the reality of that kind of volume. In other words, there's a huge light source outside. It's sky and light reflecting off of maybe the neighbor's house coming into the window, and it's reflecting off of the ground. It's a large, redirected, soft, indirect uh, uh, collection of light coming through the window and giving me just this general wrapping, uh, low contrast, high dynamic image. In other words, my shadow side here, well, it is falling into shadow, is certainly not the same extreme, and there's certainly not a hard transition like there would be with a smaller, sourcey conventional fixture or even a lamp that would generate a much harder transition and a much deeper shadow to this side. The volume of light, because it's big and diffused, it's just sort of wafting into the room and filling that space, and the rate in which it's falling off is much more subtle to the eye. It's the most beautiful kind of light that I think we can aspire to. And I like to show my students images from Vermeer in particular, because he was specifically concerned with the quality of light that he could get from a window in his studio, and he used that same backdrop for a lot of different images in his portfolio overall. So I can think of a number of different subjects that were photographed under the same kind of lighting. The window is always positioned in the same place in the studio, and he might redecorate the room either in his mind, and therefore translate it to the canvas, or physically redecorate the room, but the window is always in the same place. It's always the same corner of the studio, and it's always the same, for lack of a better word, lens that he's using to visualize that scene, because the characters tend to be basically the same size. And yet the light is always such wonderful low contrast and beautiful soft transition, large source, and it's the kind of light that we now try to emulate best with our light modifiers, the chimeras and the Westcotts and the Photoflexes, the devices that we put on our conventional fixtures in order to soften them up and produce a volume through propagation that increases and diffuses that light and lets it find its way into all the deep shadows, and just lower that contrast and extend that dynamic range. So I think the first thing that I would look for if I was going to shoot on location would be some wonderful window light opportunities for these particular reasons. It offers us the best exposure, the nicest shape, accurate color quality, so we can get texture and tone amply with light coming through a window. And I mean, take a look at the general tone of this lighting. I mean, if I look directly into my source, it has a sort of a hopeful openness to it. And if I turn and if I address the camera, I can introduce more contrast just by turning away from the key. And the more I turn from that key, the more contrast I can introduce into the image as well. So I can position my subject in a way that best utilizes the look and feel of this source, and then take full advantage of that to camera. And the results are pretty amazing. So seek a window whenever you go to location. If you can take advantage of that wonderful source, by all means. Now, we can reproduce this. That's part of the art and craft of cinematic lighting. And we'll talk about this more throughout the semester, how to produce believable, true-looking results with artificial sources, either on stage or at location. Because the one issue that you're going to have dealing with window light on location, if you're using the real sun, is the sun tracks across the sky. So as that sun angle changes outside that window, the appearance of this light is going to change as well. Now, this is an eastern-facing window. So in the morning, in the early hours of the day, hard sun is going to come through this window at a really low raking angle and create deep contrast, saturated colors, which are warmer in tone, heavy shadows, because it's harder light and coming directly through the window. It's currently late afternoon, and I chose this hour particularly to shoot this window because now the sun has tracked across the roof of my house, and it's now shining on the western side of my home where I don't have any windows entering this room. So what I have coming through this window now is very passive, reflected ambience. It's just such a huge volume that it's still coming through the window like a wonderful source. And I'm shooting at a beautiful deep stop. So I'm at about a 5.6 on a 24 millimeter Rokinon. And the results, I think, are pretty amazing. So, as a matter of course, it's important to scout your locations, look for those window opportunities, scout your locations, and decide, okay, what time of day is this window going to give me the best quality of light? Is it going to be in the morning? Is that what the script calls for? Or would it be better in the afternoon when basically the shape of this light isn't going to change much once the direct sun has arced over the house and I'm getting the indirect passive light? It's going to look more or less the same for a number of hours before the sun starts going down in the west, changing color and getting lower in the sky, where the angles are a lot like they are in the morning, very low and raky and hard. In that situation, then definitely this exposure will change. It'll change in terms of color, intensity, and contrast. But it's more sustainable for more hours as an indirect, what we call north light exposure. And we can, we can get a scene off using window light in the afternoon if it's not directly lit by the sun. So scout your locations and make sure that those windows are in the right places at the right time of day, and plan your day accordingly so you can maximize the time and the quality of light that's coming through the window. And then think about supplementing that exposure to prolong the amount of time that you have with this source in this condition. So I might have a few large conventionals outside the window so that when the sun finally does get really low and it's not the right color and intensity anymore, I can introduce my lights in and sort of continue this look with a lot of diffusion and some very large sources, and extend my shooting day as a result of that. So you've either got to be very practical with your time and get your stuff shot within, say, 2 or 3 hours of having this kind of exposure, or if you need a full day, a full 12-hour shooting day, plan on adding some conventionals outside that window to help you extend that amount of time that you can shoot with this light source. Okay, and then if you're doing all of that, then you're operating at a pretty high level, which if you're working on a large feature film, that's the only way to go in a situation like this, is to track the sun, take careful notes, go on location ahead of time, plan your shooting day, and then maximize your time with that source, and then add supplementals if you need to extend your shooting day. Okay, so that's window lighting for all intents and purposes, and of course we'll continue to have this discussion throughout the semester, and this concept will evolve as we as we learn about more concepts and more tools at our disposal. Okay, so thanks for checking it out, and I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, and if you need any references to the Vermeer paintings that I speak about in the video, remember there is a discussion about classical artists and their renderings in my 3-point lighting discussion under the section referring to inspiration. Or you can check out Vermeer online. He's very easy to access with Google. Or hopefully you have a museum in your neighborhood that, or in your city, that might possibly have some Vermeer hanging on the wall.